I was eating a sandwich when the world changed. I want to be precise about that, not metaphorically eating a sandwich. Literally. Tuna salad on dark rye with a thin smear of mustard that had gone slightly sharp because I'd left the jar open too long in the press room fridge. I remember the mustard. I remember the exact sour bite of it on the back of my tongue. I remember thinking I needed to go back to the commissary and grab a coffee before the afternoon briefing. Because the morning had been slow, and slow mornings at UEF Forward Press Command always made me tired in a way that no amount of sleep could fix. The press room at Meridian Station wasn't glamorous. None of the war correspondents who'd been stationed there would tell you otherwise. It was a long rectangular space on Deck 7 of the administrative ring, with exposed conduit running across the ceiling and fluorescent panels that buzzed at a frequency that, after 3 weeks, you stopped hearing consciously, but that lived somewhere in your skull forever. There were 12 of us at desks that morning. Maybe 11. Daria Wren from the Europa Herald had gone to file a story about the new water reclamation contract and hadn't come back yet. So maybe 11. We had screens, big ones on the wall, smaller ones at our desks, tiny personal ones clipped to our wrists. All of them were running the standard feeds. Nothing interesting was happening. Nothing interesting had been happening for 6 weeks. The Vashari had gone quiet after their initial contact in November, and the diplomatic channels were doing whatever diplomatic channels do when nobody's talking but everybody's watching everybody else. I took another bite of the sandwich. Then every screen in the room went white. Not static, not a technical failure. White, pure, clean, absolute white, like someone had taken all the light in the observable universe and poured it into a flat rectangle. The buzz of the fluorescent panels cut out. The hum of the air circulation system, which you didn't notice until it was gone, also cut out. The room became a very specific kind of quiet that I have never heard anywhere else before or since. It was the quiet of 13 human beings simultaneously holding their breath. Then the white resolved into a shape. I don't have the language for what the Vashari looked like in that transmission. I've tried to write it 100 times in the months since, and I've thrown every attempt away. Other journalists who were there that day have written their own descriptions, tall, they usually say, or luminous, or angular. Wren wrote like geometry had learned to be disappointed in you. I thought that was close, but not quite right. The Vashari who appeared on our screens that morning looked, to me, like someone had taken the concept of authority and given it a skeleton. Like if contempt could develop bilateral symmetry and a face. There were 3 of them, arranged in a formation that felt deliberate, practiced. The one in the center was marginally taller than the others, or maybe it just carried itself in a way that created the impression of height. Behind them was something that might have been a room or might have been a void. It was hard to tell because the background seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. The center one spoke first. I know there's been debate about the translation. There will probably always be debate about the translation, because the Vashari's primary communication mode is not, technically, speech in the way we understand speech. It's more like structured intention, directed meaning. When the Vashari linguistic interface translated the words for us, it produced a voice that sounded calm, measured, and vaguely British for reasons I still don't fully understand. The content of what it said is not in debate. What it said was, "Attention, inhabitants of the 3rd planetary body of your star. You have been evaluated. You have been found dangerous. You have been found unstable. You have been found unfit for galactic integration at this time. You will cease all faster-than-light propulsion experiments. You will cease all long-range weapons testing. You will cease all biological enhancement programs. You will surrender coordinates of your primary military installations for observation purposes. You have 18 of your planetary rotations to comply. Non-compliance will result in containment. This is not a negotiation. This is a notification." Then the screens went white again. Then they came back to normal. My tuna sandwich was sitting on the desk in front of me, and someone in the room, I think it was Caleb Frost from the Outer Rim Tribune, let out a breath that was almost a laugh. The way you sometimes laugh when something is so far outside your frame of reference that your brain doesn't have another response queued up. "Containment," said another voice. I think it was Ewan Park, our senior tech correspondent. She said the word like she was testing its weight, like she was picking up a rock and wasn't sure if it was a rock or something that had been made to look like one. 18 days. That was what they'd given us. I looked at my sandwich and decided I wasn't hungry anymore. The press briefing that afternoon was, To put it professionally, a disaster. Not because the UEF information officers didn't try. They did. Commander Ashad Delacroix, who handled press relations for Forward Command, came out in her standard gray uniform with the kind of carefully arranged calm on her face that she always wore at briefings, the kind that said, "I have been informed of this situation, and I have already processed my feelings about it in private so that I can be functional in public." She was good at that face. She'd had a lot of practice. She told us that the UEF leadership was aware of the transmission. She told us it was being analyzed. She told us that humanity's response would be measured, considered, and appropriate. She told us that there was no cause for panic. 17 hands went up simultaneously. The question everyone was asking, in 16 different variations, was, what does containment mean? Delacroix said that was under analysis. What are we going to do with the 18 days? Under analysis. Are we going to comply? The response will be measured, considered, and appropriate. Does the UEF believe the Vashari can actually enforce this? Analysis. I didn't raise my hand. I was writing in my notebook, actual paper. I'd started keeping a paper notebook 2 years into this assignment because there's something that happens to your thinking when you write by hand that doesn't happen when you type. And I was writing down the exact words of the transmission as I remembered them, checking them against the recording on my wrist screen, getting them right. You have been found dangerous. I wrote that one twice and underlined it both times. Because here's the thing. Here's the thing I kept coming back to in the days that followed, the thing that I think got lost in a lot of the coverage that came out of those 18 days. The Vashari didn't say we were weak. They didn't say we were primitive or backwards or underdeveloped, the way the Keth had said when they made first contact in 2341, all that careful diplomatic condescension wrapped in scientific language. The Vashari didn't look at humanity and see something small. They looked at humanity and saw something that scared them. And they tried to handle it before it got bigger. That's a completely different thing. And I think, if I'm honest, I think understanding that difference is what explains everything that came after. The night after the transmission, I went down to the observation deck. Meridian Station was in a geostationary orbit above the Atlantic, and from the observation deck you could see the curve of the Earth below, the blue-green of the ocean, the white spiral of cloud systems, the dark smear of the African coastline when the Terminator line was positioned right. There were usually a few people up there in the evenings, station personnel off-duty just sitting with the view. It was one of the things I'd learned to appreciate about being stationed here, the view. You never really got tired of it. That night there were maybe 40 people on the deck, which was more than I'd ever seen. Nobody was talking much. A few people had drinks. Most were just standing at the viewports looking down at the planet. I found a spot near the starboard window and stood there for a while. I was thinking about the transmission. I was thinking about the word dangerous. I was thinking about something that had happened to me once, years ago, when I was a young correspondent covering a dispute between the Hellion Mining Collective and the Outer Belt indigenous communities. A situation that had been building for years, small incidents, small tensions, and then one morning a collective security team showed up at the main settlement with a written demand and a deadline. And I'd watched the settlement council receive that demand, and I'd watched their faces. And what I'd seen on those faces hadn't been fear. It had been something that looked a lot like recognition. Like, oh, so that's what we are, in their eyes. That's the kind of thing they think we are. And what do you do with that? Some of the settlement council had wanted to comply. Some of them had wanted to fight, but the one who spoke the clearest, a woman named HFY, who I've never forgotten, who kept a journal of the dispute that she eventually published, Hessa had said something like, "The way you respond to being told what you are shapes what you become. So be careful what you accept and what you refuse." Standing at the viewport of Meridian Station, looking at the Earth, I thought about HFY. I thought about 18 days. I thought about what humanity was going to accept and what it was going to refuse. Then I went back to my bunk and tried to sleep, and mostly failed, and at 4 in the morning wrote the first of the dispatches that would eventually make up the foundation of this document. Part 2, the Council of 18. The UEF Emergency Council convened within 6 hours of the transmission. I wasn't in the room. Nobody in the press pool was in the room. What I know about those first sessions comes from 3 sources. The official UEF minutes released 14 months later, the personal memoir of Delegate Pieter Asamo of the Pan-African Bloc, and an extremely long and sometimes contradictory conversation I had with Commander Delacroix on the record after the crisis resolved. I've tried to triangulate between these accounts where they differ, and I'll flag the places where they differ significantly. What everyone agrees on is this: the first session was chaos. Not the operatic kind of chaos that makes good film, the quiet, grinding, exhausting kind. 37 delegates from every major bloc and territory of Earth's political union, plus representatives from the Lunar Authority, the Mars Colonial Government, the Outer Belt Federation, and the Deep Space Stations. 112 people in total who had direct standing in the room, and 400 more with observer or advisory status. 6 simultaneous translation streams, 3 competing proposals on the floor within the first hour. Proposal 1 from the Eurasian Cooperative Bloc: immediate compliance with the Vashari demands. Suspend FTL experiments, suspend long-range weapons testing, and open dialogue about the biological enhancement question. The argument: we don't know what containment means, and we should assume it means something catastrophic. We should buy time with compliance, and use the time to understand what we're dealing with. Proposal 2 from the Pacific Alliance and the American Continental Union: immediate noncompliance. The argument: any power that opens negotiations with a threat has already revealed that it sees us as a target. Compliance will not make them see us differently. It will simply give them a picture of our vulnerabilities under the cover of cooperation. Noncompliance, backed by an immediate acceleration of the very programs they want stopped, is the only honest response. Proposal 3 from the Mars Colonial Government, submitted through Delegate Asamo's bloc: non-compliance with the military demands, compliance with the transparency demands. Suspend nothing. But instead of refusing to provide coordinates, provide open access. Full transparency. Let them see everything. The argument, and this is the one I find most interesting, the one that I think doesn't get enough attention in the popular histories, is that the Vashari had called humanity dangerous and unstable. And maybe the right response to being called dangerous is not to hide the danger, but to show it, completely and without apology, and let the other party make an informed decision about what they want to do with that information. I'll say this about Proposal 3. It took more nerve than either of the other two, because it required accepting the premise of the Vashari's assessment, and then using that premise as a lever. It was a gamble on the idea that what the Vashari actually feared wasn't human capability, but human unpredictability, and that if you replaced unpredictability with radical honesty, you might change the calculation. The council argued for 6 hours. Then they called a recess, reconvened, and argued for 4 more. At the end of the second session, according to the official minutes, they reached what they called a provisional consensus position. According to Asamo's memoir, what actually happened was that 3 delegates got into a shouting match in the corridor. Someone knocked over a pitcher of water, and then everyone was so exhausted and slightly absurd feeling that they were able to agree on something just to stop. The provisional consensus: non-compliance with all suspension demands, silence on the coordinate request, and an immediate convening of what would become known as the HFY Working Group. The HFY Working Group is where things get interesting. Admiral Seraphine HFY was not, in January 2386, a name that most people outside military circles would have recognized. I knew of her. I'd done a brief profile 2 years earlier, the kind of 200-word capsule biography that runs in the sidebar of a longer story, when she'd been promoted to command of the 7th Fleet. The headline had been something forgettable. I remember she'd had strong opinions about propulsion engineering, which at the time had seemed like a niche interest for a fleet admiral, and which would later turn out to be exactly the right kind of expertise to have in exactly the right moment. She was, at the time of the Vashari ultimatum, 53 years old. She'd been born in Lagos, schooled in Nairobi and Montreal, and had spent the first 15 years of her military career in deep space operations before transitioning to fleet command. She was the kind of officer who got described in reviews as technically exceptional and strategically unconventional, which in military language generally means someone who makes her superiors nervous and her subordinates devoted. When the council tapped her to run the working group, it was partly because of her technical background, partly because the 7th Fleet, which she commanded, had the highest operational readiness rating in the UEF Navy, and partly, according to Asamo, because when the council described the situation to her and asked her what she thought the first priority should be, she said, without hesitating, understanding what they're afraid of. The council had been expecting something about force projection or defensive positioning. Understanding what they're afraid of, Okafor said again, apparently, when the silence became expectant. They said we were dangerous. That's information. Let's figure out what specifically triggered that assessment. Let's understand the exact nature of their fear, because how we respond should be shaped by what they actually saw. Then she apparently asked for two things: unrestricted access to every piece of intelligence the UEF had collected on the Vashari over the previous year, and a meeting with the lead xenolinguistics team that had been analyzing the transmission. They gave her both within 4 hours. The working group convened the next morning. Okafor, her chief of staff, Captain Yosef Marchetti, 6 fleet commanders from the major branches, 4 xenolinguistics specialists, 2 propulsion engineers, an AI strategic modeling team, and this is the part that surprised me when I found out, months later, a historian. The historian's name was Dr. Petra Haas, and she'd spent 30 years studying galactic power dynamics, specifically the historical patterns of how technologically advanced civilizations responded to perceived emerging threats from less advanced ones. She had a theory, apparently, about what was happening, and the theory was not comfortable. I'll get to Dr. Haas's theory, but first I need to tell you about Day 4. Day 4 of the 18 days was when the signal changed. Up to that point, the Vashari had been silent. Their initial transmission had been a single broadcast, received simultaneously by every communications system on Earth and in human-controlled space. Since then, nothing. No follow-up. No response to the probes humanity had sent into the transmission's origin vector. Nothing on any monitored frequency. On the morning of Day 4, that changed. A secondary signal was detected by 3 separate deep space relay stations simultaneously. It wasn't addressed to humanity. It was, as near as the analysts could determine, an internal Vashari communication, either a signal they hadn't bothered to encrypt, or a signal they'd intentionally left unencrypted so that humanity would intercept it. The xenolinguistics team spent 18 hours on the translation, and then delivered their analysis to the working group with the kind of carefully neutral professional tone that people use when they're trying to report something frightening, without being the one responsible for how frightening it is. What the signal said, in approximate translation, with significant uncertainty in the interpretive layer, was something like: the third body species has not yet responded. Containment staging is at preliminary configuration. If compliance is not received by deadline, advanced denial assets will be positioned per Protocol 7A, estimated duration of 7-day active containment, 3 years of their time. Estimated political compliance probability at 6 months. High. Note: the third body species propulsion rate has exceeded preliminary models. Revise estimate. Revise protocol. Flag for reevaluation. The part that the xenolinguistics team spent most of their report discussing was the last 3 sentences. The third body species propulsion rate has exceeded preliminary models. Revise estimate. Revise protocol. Flag for reevaluation. Dr. Haas, according to Asamo's memoir, read the translation and immediately said, "There it is." And then she explained her theory. Dr. Haas's theory was called the Cascade Threshold Model, and she'd been developing it for about 12 years by the time the Vashari showed up. The short version, and I'm going to give you the short version because the long version involves about 40 pages of academic notation that I am not qualified to simplify, is this. In galactic history, when an advanced civilization encounters an emerging one, there's a moment. A specific moment where the emerging civilization crosses what Haas called the Cascade Threshold, the point at which its development becomes, from the advanced civilization's perspective, uncontrollable. Not because the emerging civilization is actually uncontrollable, but because it starts developing faster than any containment or management strategy can keep pace with. Before the threshold, an advanced civilization can manage an emerging one with any number of standard tools: trade restrictions, selective technology sharing, proxy conflicts, passive observation. After the threshold, none of those tools work anymore because the emerging civilization has started generating its own momentum. its own cascading chain of innovations and adaptations that can't be interrupted from the outside, because each one leads immediately to three more. Humanity, according to Haas, had been approaching the cascade threshold for about 50 years. The Vashari had noticed. The ultimatum wasn't, Haas argued, a confident power play from a species that felt secure in its dominance. It was a desperate move from a species that had looked at humanity's development trajectory and realized that the window for effective intervention was closing fast. The 18 days weren't given as a comfortable timeline. They were given because the Vashari calculated that 18 days was approximately how long they had before humanity's capabilities would make the threatened containment tactically impossible. The third-body species propulsion rate has exceeded preliminary models. They'd miscalculated. Humanity had already crossed the threshold, or was crossing it. The Vashari were watching their containment window close in real time. So what does that mean for us? Someone asked in the working group session, according to Asamo. Haas had said, "It means the ultimatum is theater. It means they don't actually know if they can contain us. It means they're hoping we don't know that." The room had been quiet. Then Okafor had said, "How do we respond to theater?" And Haas had said, "You put on a better show." Part 3, what was built in 11 days. I want to be careful here. I was not in the working group sessions. I was not in the shipyards. I was not inside any of the classified facilities where the decisions of day 5 through day 15 were made and executed. What I know about the 11 days between the working group's conclusions and the launch comes from a combination of official records, interviews with participants, and the things I personally witnessed as a correspondent attached to Meridian Station. What I personally witnessed, a change. It's hard to describe a change that happens in a place you've been living in for months because changes like that happen in layers. It's not one moment. It's 100 small moments that only make sense as a pattern in retrospect. But I'll try. Day 5, the commissary started running out of coffee by mid-morning, which meant more people were working earlier and longer than before. Day 6, 3 of the administrative offices on Deck 4 were converted to something, we weren't told what, and access to that section of the deck was restricted. Commander Delacroix gave a brief statement saying the restriction was temporary and operational in nature. Nobody believed the temporary part. Day 7, the station's docking schedule, which was normally public information posted on the General Information System, was taken off the public system. Ships were coming and going, you could see them through the viewports, but what they were carrying and where they were going was no longer information that the press pool had access to. Day 8, I noticed that the military personnel on the station, the ones I passed in corridors, the ones who ate in the commissary, the ones who did physical conditioning in the small gym on Deck 3, something about them had changed. It wasn't their behavior exactly. They were still professional, still polite, still did the things they normally did. But there was a quality to their movement that was different, like they were carrying something invisible. Like every person in uniform on that station, had been handed a weight that I couldn't see but could somehow feel in the way they walked. Day 9, I got a message from my editor at the Tribune asking if I had anything new, and I wrote back that I was working on something but couldn't tell him what it was yet because I wasn't sure myself what it was, and he wrote back something impatient, and I ignored it because I was trying to figure out whether the pattern I was seeing meant what I thought it meant. Day 10, Commander Delacroix called an informal press briefing, off the record. She sat in a small conference room with the 12 of us and said something that I've thought about many times since. She said, "I want you to understand that what's happening right now is real. I can't tell you the specifics. I can tell you that the people who are making decisions right now are not making them carelessly. They understand what's at stake, all of it, the big things and the small things, they understand." Someone asked if we were going to war. Delacroix thought about that for a moment and said, "We're going to respond." Then the briefing was over. Day 11, 3 junior communications officers were reassigned from Meridian Station to destinations unknown, and their desks sat empty for 4 days before anyone moved into them. Day 12, Ewan Park, our tech correspondent, disappeared for 6 hours and came back looking like she'd seen something she couldn't write about yet. She sat down at her desk and stared at her screen for 45 minutes without typing anything. Then she started typing and didn't stop for 3 hours. She wouldn't tell me what she was writing. Later, I found out she'd been taken, under a temporary security clearance, to observe a test run of something in the station's lower engineering bays. She still won't tell me exactly what it was. What she'll say is that it changed how she thought about what humans were capable of making when they were given a reason to stop arguing about whether they should. Day 13, I stopped sleeping well, not because of anxiety or not just because of anxiety, because there was a sound. A low vibration almost below the range of hearing that seemed to be coming from somewhere deep in the station's superstructure. It wasn't alarming exactly. It was more like the station was doing something it hadn't done before. Like a new gear had been engaged somewhere in the machinery of the thing, and the whole body of the structure was adjusting to accommodate it. Day 14, the view from the observation deck changed. That's the only way I can put it. The view changed. Because there were ships out there that hadn't been there before. I have to tell you about the ships. I've tried to describe them in other pieces I've written, and I always feel like I fail. Maybe because there's a limit to what language can do with a visual experience that fundamentally exceeded your existing categories. Maybe because describing something vast and new with words that were built to describe the familiar is like trying to draw a three-dimensional object on a two-dimensional surface. You can gesture at the thing, but you can't capture it. Let me try anyway. They were large. That's the first thing. They were large in a way that reset your sense of scale. You'd be looking at the observation viewport, looking at the curve of Earth below, and you'd see what you assumed was a standard orbital platform or a supply hauler in the mid-distance. Something familiar. And then you'd realize the platform was actually a kilometer behind what you thought was the mid-distance. And what you thought was the mid-distance was actually the hull of something that you were only seeing a portion of, and the portion you were seeing was bigger than Meridian Station. There were 17 of them by day 14. I know that number because I counted. I pressed my face against the viewport glass like a child and I counted. One after another, moving in slow orbital arcs, maintaining distances from each other that, seen from the station, looked like proximity, but that you knew, if you thought about the math, were actually hundreds of kilometers apart. They moved the way large things move in space, with a patience and absence of urgency that made them seem almost languid until you remembered what something that size moving at even a fraction of orbital velocity actually represented in terms of kinetic energy. They were different from each other. That's the second thing. Standard UEF fleet doctrine called for classes, destroyers that looked like destroyers, cruisers that looked like cruisers, carriers in their distinctive wedge and bay configuration. These ships followed some of that doctrine and violated a lot of it. One of them had an overall profile that suggested a heavy cruiser, but had a secondary hull mounted above the primary one in a way I'd never seen before, connected by 3 massive struts. Another was roughly cylindrical, but studded along its length with what might have been sensor arrays, or might have been something else entirely. Another had a bow section that was recognizably military standard UEF construction, and a stern section that looked like it had been designed by someone working from a different set of assumptions about what sterns were for. Later, much later, when the specifications became partially public, I would learn that these ships had been in various stages of construction at 6 different classified yards for the past 2 to 4 years, and that what the Vashari ultimatum had done was provide authorization to stop being careful about timelines. The shipyards had pulled everyone. Every available engineer, every propulsion technician, every systems integrator who could be cleared and transported. They'd worked around the clock. They'd solved problems in hours that had been tabled for months because nobody had been willing to commit to the engineering risk. When you're told you have 18 days, apparently, the engineering risk becomes a lot more acceptable. The working group's response to the ultimatum, I would learn later, had consisted of 3 components. 1, official diplomatic silence. No response to the Vashari, no acknowledgement, no communication on any channel. 2, a public statement from the UEF civilian government acknowledging the transmission and assuring the population that the government was engaged in a measured and appropriate response. Measured and appropriate. Delacroix's phrase, neutral enough to mean almost anything. 3, the ships. Part 4, Day 18. The morning of Day 18. The day of the deadline, I woke up before my alarm. This almost never happens to me. I sleep like a person who has made peace with their circumstances. which is a generous way of saying I can sleep through almost anything and wake up exactly when I plan to. But on the morning of day 18, I woke up at 4:47 station time, which was almost 2 hours before my alarm, and lay in my bunk for a moment in the dark, and knew immediately what day it was. There wasn't a feeling I can cleanly describe. It was something between alertness and dread, but dread isn't quite right either, because dread implies a clear sense of what you're afraid of, and I didn't have that. I had something more like anticipation of significance. The feeling of being in the right place at the right time in a way that you haven't earned and can't control. I got up. I made myself instant coffee with the heating coil in my cabin. I sat at my small desk and looked at the notes I'd been keeping for 2 weeks. 40 pages of handwritten observations, questions, half-formed analysis. The paper felt important in a way that digital files don't, which I know is irrational but which I believe anyway. I went to the observation deck. It was already crowded. Not just with station personnel this time. There were people there I didn't recognize, people in civilian clothes, people who didn't have the particular postural habits that military service and long-term station living tend to instill. I found out later they were maintenance workers from the lower levels of the station who'd come up for the view on their rest break, and technical staff from the Civilian Research Division who normally kept to their own sections, and 2 galley workers who'd apparently decided that whatever was being cooked in the kitchen could wait. Everybody was looking at the same thing. The ships had moved overnight. They were still in orbit, but where before they'd been distributed across a wide arc, spread out, quiet, oriented in no particular pattern, now they were grouped. In formation, though not a formation from any doctrine I knew, more like an arrangement. Like someone had decided where each of the 17 needed to be in relation to the others, and then moved them there very slowly and deliberately through the night, so that by morning they were all in position. The formation was visible from the observation viewport as a long curve, a crescent, the open end of the crescent facing away from Earth. The ships caught the early orbital sunlight along their upper surfaces. Some of them had running lights, amber and white, the standard UEF designation lights, and those lights were on, small points of color against the dark hulls. They were, I thought, beautiful. Not in a way I would have anticipated. They were warships, or things built along the principles of warships, and the beauty wasn't the wrong kind, not the beauty that erases what a thing is. It was the beauty that comes from something made with complete commitment to its purpose, where every line and proportion and element exists because it needs to, where there's no ornament and no waste. I don't know when I started feeling that way about ships. Maybe that morning. Someone next to me, I never got her name, said quietly, "How many do you think are inside the crescent, that we can't see from here?" I looked at the open end of the crescent formation, the part facing away from Earth. I hadn't thought to count what might be beyond it. At 0800 station time, the screens in the press room came back to white. The Vashari again. Same formation, same 3 figures, same center figure with its quality of structural contempt. But this time, and this is the detail that the xenolinguistics team would spend weeks analyzing afterward, because the interpretation was not obvious. Something about the center figure's posture was different. It's hard to put this in terms that convey what I perceived, and what I perceived correctly versus what I perceived incorrectly, because I'm not a xenolinguistics expert. But for what it's worth, my immediate impression in that first second before translation started was that the thing on the screen was recalculating. The translation came in the same calm, measured, vaguely British voice as before. The deadline has been reached. A response from the third planetary body has not been received. Containment Protocol 7A is. And then the voice stopped. Not because the Vashari stopped speaking. They didn't stop speaking immediately, but because something happened that made the linguistic interface pause, and what the interface paused on was a word. A Vashari word that didn't have a clean translation into any human language, that the xenolinguistics team would later render as somewhere between reconsider, reclassify, and wait. The Vashari figure had apparently done something, made some gesture or subvocalization or directed meaning expression that interrupted its own statement. And what it directed, at the camera, at whatever recording or transmission device it was using at the destination of the signal, was that word. Reconsider, reclassify, wait. Then there was a pause in the transmission that lasted 14 seconds. I know it was 14 seconds because Caleb Frost timed it on his wrist screen and announced it out loud in the press room in a voice that was trying to be steady and not quite succeeding. Then the transmission resumed. The deadline has been reached. Observation of third body military positioning is ongoing. The third planetary body has not complied. The third planetary body has also not communicated. The third planetary body has... Another pause, shorter this time, maybe 4 seconds. Deployed assets. Containment Protocol 7A is suspended pending updated evaluation. This transmission will terminate. White screen. Normal screen. Absolute silence in the press room. Then Ewan Park, who had been to the engineering bays and seen whatever she'd seen, made a sound that was not quite a laugh and not quite a sob and said, "They blinked." The ships launched at 0917 station time. Not toward the Vashari, not on an attack vector of any kind. This is important, and I want to be clear about it. What happened that morning was not humanity starting a war. What happened was something more complicated and, I think, more significant. The ships launched on a trajectory that would take them, over the course of 6 hours, to a position approximately 12,000 kilometers beyond the visible edge of the solar system, past the heliopause, past the boundary between human-controlled space and the galactic commons. And then they stopped, and they waited. In formation, the same crescent, the open end pointed outward at the galaxy. At whoever was watching. And people were watching. We knew that by then. The same monitoring systems that had detected the Vashari's internal communication on day 4 had been running continuously since, and what they'd shown was traffic. The galactic communication bands that humanity had been able to monitor, not decode, not fully but detect and count, had spiked dramatically in the days following the Vashari ultimatum. Something like 40 times the baseline signal volume. Dozens of different signal signatures, some of them Vashari, some of them belonging to species that humanity had cataloged but never directly contacted. All of them active, all of them pointed in the general direction of the third planetary body of this particular yellow star. The galaxy was watching, and the fleet that had been assembled in 11 days, 17 ships that the UEF had revealed, plus however many more that were positioned beyond the visible crescent, that only appeared in the formation as gaps, as the implied shape of a larger whole, sailed to the edge of human space and deployed there like a statement. Not a threat, a statement. Here is what we built, here is what we are, here is what we can do when we decide to. I remember standing at the observation viewport and watching them go. It took a long time. Large objects moving at low orbital velocity take a long time to pass a fixed point. I stood there longer than I meant to, watching the shapes drift across the window, the amber and white running lights getting smaller and then disappearing as the ships cleared the station's arc and moved into open space. The viewport was crowded with people. I could feel the warmth of other bodies on either side of me, the slight pressure of an elbow, the sound of someone near me breathing carefully. At some point, I'm not sure exactly when, the person next to me on the right reached out and gripped the edge of the viewport frame. Just held on to it. Not dramatically, not with any visible emotion. Just reached out and held on, the way you hold onto something solid when you're not quite sure where the ground is. I understood that completely. Because here's the truth. I didn't know if what was happening was the right thing. I still don't know entirely. The histories will argue about it for a long time. Whether the display was necessary or whether compliance and dialogue might have achieved more. Whether the Vashari would actually have been able to enforce containment, or whether Haas's model was correct and the ultimatum was always theater. Whether by choosing the response that we chose, humanity set a precedent for how it engages with the galaxy that will cost something eventually, in some way that we can't yet see. Those are real questions. I'm not going to pretend they're not. But I also know what I saw on that observation deck, and what I felt. And what I felt, watching those ships move out to the edge of the solar system to take their position in the galaxy's sight line, was not militarism or nationalism, or the particular grim satisfaction of having demonstrated superiority over someone who underestimated you. It was something older and simpler than that. It was the feeling of watching something decide what it is. Part 6, the silence and what came after. After the fleet deployed, the Vashari went quiet again. Not the 18 days of operational planning quiet. A different quality of silence. Less like the held breath before a decision and more like the long exhale after one. The working group waited. The emergency council waited. The entire monitoring apparatus that humanity had dedicated to the galactic communication bands waited and watched and recorded every signal and sent them to the xenolinguistics teams, and the teams worked through the signals. And every day there was a report, and every day the report said, in essence, the traffic is high, the traffic has changed in character, we are still working on the interpretive layer. On day 22, 4 days after the deadline, 4 days after the fleet took its position, a signal came in that was addressed directly to humanity. Not the broad broadcast of the original ultimatum. A targeted signal, addressed to the same reception point that had been used to receive the Vashari's initial transmission. The xenolinguistics team worked through the night on it, and their morning report to the working group was described by Asamo as producing a room that was very quiet for a very long time. The signal translated. Attention, inhabitants of the third planetary body. Your assets have been observed. Your capabilities have been noted. The evaluation of your species is being revised. The previous classification of dangerous, unstable, unfit is under reassessment. A formal diplomatic contact has been proposed by 3 member species of the Galactic Congress. Details to follow through standard first contact protocols. This is not a concession. This is an acknowledgement that the information available for the previous evaluation was incomplete. Proceed accordingly. Someone in the working group apparently asked what proceed accordingly meant. Nobody had an immediate answer. The formal diplomatic contact happened 6 weeks later. I wasn't there for that either. It took place at a neutral station designated by the Galactic Congress, and access was limited to UEF diplomatic staff and a very small pool of pool reporters, of which I was not one, having somewhat burned my professional relationships with the UEF press office by spending day 12 through day 18 writing a series of dispatches that were, I admit, not entirely respectful of the information restrictions that were in place. But I've read the transcripts, and what struck me in the transcripts, what I keep coming back to, is a moment in the second formal session, when the Vashari senior delegate said something through the linguistic interface that the translator rendered as, "We acknowledge that our model of your species' development rate was insufficient. We acknowledge that the previous intervention timeline was poorly calculated. We do not apologize. Apology is not a concept that our diplomatic tradition includes. We acknowledge." And the UEF's lead diplomat, a woman named Dr. Oluwatobi Ademi, who had spent 30 years in galactic treaty work, apparently said back calmly, "We acknowledge that you were afraid of us. We do not consider that an insult. We consider it a starting point." There was a long pause in the session record after that. Then the Vashari delegation asked for a 30-minute recess. When they came back, the structure of the conversation had changed. The formal positions were still on the table. The demands and counterpositions were still being negotiated, but something in the texture of the exchange had shifted. Something that the xenolinguistics team described, in their analysis of the session recordings, as a quality that they translated tentatively as mutual orientation. The Vashari expression for the moment, in a diplomatic encounter, when 2 parties accept that they are dealing with something that is actually there, rather than something that can be managed from a distance. Humanity had, apparently, become real to the Vashari on day 18. It had taken a fleet. Part 7, What I Carry. It's been 14 months since day 18. The diplomatic process continues. It's slow, complicated, and sometimes maddening. 3 steps forward, 2 steps of definitional argument about what forward means. The Vashari are not easy interlocutors. They are precise, uncompromising, and operate from a set of assumptions about galactic social structure that sometimes requires a whole session just to unpack. There are other species involved now, the 3 who proposed the diplomatic contact, plus 2 more who have requested observer status, plus 1 who nobody expected and whose participation has added an entirely new layer of complexity to the translation work. The fleet is still deployed. Not in the same configuration. Some of the original 17 have rotated back for maintenance and refit, others have taken their place. The crescent formation has evolved into something more dispersed. But there are always human ships at the edge of the heliopause. There will be, I think, for a long time. I'm still at Meridian Station. I've been home twice, brief, disorienting visits where I walked around cities that were full of people living the unchanged shape of their days, and I felt like a person who had been somewhere and come back unable to fully explain it. My family is patient with me, my editor less so. I'm working on this document partly because I think it needs to exist, and partly because the act of writing it is the only way I know to organize the experience into something that has a beginning, middle, and end, even though the thing itself hasn't ended. What do I think 14 months out? I think that the Vashari were right that we're dangerous. Not in the way they thought, not as a threat to galactic order or stability in the simplistic way their initial evaluation suggested, but dangerous in the way that anything with momentum is dangerous, not because it intends harm, but because it is moving, and moving things change the landscape around them whether they mean to or not. Humanity is moving, has been moving for a long time. The speed of that movement surprised the Vashari, and I think it still surprises them. And I think that surprise is an ongoing feature of this relationship that we'll be managing for decades. I think the working group made the right call. Not the only possible right call. I want to be careful about that. There were other paths, but the call they made was coherent. It was honest. It said, this is what we are. We didn't build this to threaten you. We built it because you told us we had 18 days and we had things that needed building. And now you know. I think Dr. Haas was right about the cascade threshold. I think humanity crossed it sometime in the last decade, maybe longer. And I think we're still in the middle of the cascade. And I think what that means for the next century of galactic engagement is something that nobody can fully anticipate, including us. And I think about HFY, who I mentioned at the beginning of this document, who said, the way you respond to being told what you are shapes what you become. So be careful what you accept and what you refuse. We refused the classification, dangerous, unstable, unfit. We didn't accept those as the permanent last word. We showed up instead. We showed up at the edge of our own solar system with everything we'd built and said, look again, look with better information. Look at what unfit actually looks like when it decides to be present. And they looked. And they revised their estimate. That's not a fairy tale ending. The revision is not the same as acceptance, and acceptance is not the same as peace, and peace is not something you arrive at so much as something you sustain, day by day, decision by decision. There's a long road ahead, and it goes through territory that nobody has mapped, and there are other species out there beyond the Vashari who are watching and drawing their own conclusions. But we're on the road. That's something. I want to close with one more thing. On day 14, when I first saw the ships in their crescent formation from the observation deck, there was a child there. I don't know how she got there. The station didn't normally have children on it, and I assumed she was the kid of someone in the civilian research division, or maybe of a contractor. She was maybe 8 or 9 years old, with a long braid of dark hair and a gray station-issue sweatshirt that was too big for her. She was pressed against the viewport with both palms flat on the glass and her nose almost touching it, looking at the ships. I watched her for a moment. She turned to whoever was with her, I think a parent, a tall person in a green jacket who was looking at the ships too, and said, in a voice that was completely matter-of-fact, the way children state things they're certain of, those are ours. Not as a question, not with pride exactly or not only with pride. Just as a statement of fact, as an orientation, as a way of naming what she was looking at. Those are ours. The adult put a hand on the back of her head, gentle, not quite a pat, more like a grounding touch, the kind you give someone when you want them to know you're there. Yeah, the adult said, they are. I wrote that exchange in my notebook that night and then closed the notebook and didn't open it again for 3 days because I wasn't sure what I thought about it yet. I'm still not completely sure. But I keep coming back to it, the child's certainty, the way she named the ships, the way she named the relationship between herself and those enormous, new, still unnamed things hanging in the dark outside the glass. Those are ours. Maybe that's the whole story, actually. Maybe everything that came before and everything that will come after. The ultimatum, the working group, the 11 days, the fleet, the crescent, the edge of the heliopause, the diplomatic transcripts, all of it. Maybe all of it is just the long way around to that one simple thing. We are what built those ships. And what built those ships was us. And when the galaxy looked up and saw them, it finally, for the first time, saw us completely. That's terrifying if you're on the outside looking in. That's something else entirely if you're looking out.